everyone. This is Hen from Product Manager HQ. Today, I have with me Hemanth Setty, who is Senior Vice President of Markets and Markets. Here at Product Manager HQ, we are interviewing product leaders to hear about their experiences, journey, and lessons in product management. Hemanth, we're very excited to have you today. You have more than 20 years of experience in building products. Now you also have experience in in mentoring and building products on your own. So very excited to have you and ask you questions about all of that.
Awesome. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me here, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Yeah. So your journey into product was more from an engineering background, and then you also went and got your MBA as well. Can you talk about how you went from the technical engineering background, what drove you to get your business degree, and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I started my early part of my career kind of in engineering roles, basically in the software engineering side, doing a lot of development activities. And I did enjoy that. It was something that came natural to me. I liked the kind of work we did, but I knew there was something missing in terms of what I wanted to do in my career and how I wanted to kind of approach a business, building a product, and building a company. And at that time, product management was not really a job title, right? It was something it's relatively new in the last maybe 5, 10 years that has become a little bit more mainstream. But it was almost felt like it was a calling for me. It's like I wanted to do something like that, but I didn't know I wanted to do that, right? So, I kind of, went into different routes and different ways of kind of thinking about it. And, first, started working in a number of startups. Well, that was my early part of my career where I started working in small companies. And in those companies, you tend to do a lot of different things. And that was the first exposure I had into, okay, something like a product management role where you don't really have one task or one type of activity. You're doing, business, you're doing customer support, you're doing, customer success, you're doing a number of different activities to keep the business going, right? And that basically started to give me a little bit of confidence in terms of what, that's where I want to kind of spend my career on. That's what I really wanted to do. But I knew there was a gap. There was a gap in terms of how I wanted to approach the business side of things and how I wanted to approach the growing a business and developing a company. And this is where kind of what, I think it makes sense for me to do an MBA, and I ended up doing my MBA in Chicago. And through that process, learned a lot about things that I had no clue about: accounting, or finance, entrepreneurship, and getting a little bit more of a broader exposure into outside of just the technology and product development world. Then the next stage of my career, I ended up, kind of working in consulting firms. But essentially in those firms, it was more focused on basically innovating and building products for our clients. So it was more on kind of the innovation side, where we ended up working with either startups or, innovation hubs within larger firms. And it tended to be mostly financial services because I was in New York, and that ended up becoming a lot of the place where I ended up, okay, how do we, create a new initiative within the bank or within the fund that we were building up. And that gave me exposure to both kind of the startup mindset as well as the large company mindset, and how to translate between the two different worlds and kind of build products. And that's where a lot of my interests and passion has basically led me to kind of focus in on the enterprise space and become part of that enterprise world in terms of building products there.
How would you define enterprise product management compared to the startup product management?
Correct. And so this, a simplistic way to look at it is enterprise product management is where you are building software for businesses. You are building products and capabilities for businesses, right? Versus the, typical consumer product management is, think of the Facebooks, Googles of the world, where you're targeting millions and millions of customers. So that's a simplistic breakdown. but you're also getting a lot of companies that are now focused on enterprise product management, but having a little bit more of a consumer flair to it, right? So while Uber is selling ride shares to you and me, but they're also doing groceries to small businesses, right? So you are getting a lot of gray area in terms of what enterprise product management really means. But the challenges are very, very different, right? Uber selling services to us as users of their rideshare services versus Uber selling businesses to somebody like a department store trying to do groceries and things like that, right? So those are the kinds of things that are very different. But at a simplistic level, it is about building products for businesses, and how you can integrate your capabilities and products into their life cycle. At the end of the day, it is much more about making their business work better, whether it's faster, cheaper, smoother, whatever metric you define. It's about making them, kind of successful in their business so that they can achieve their objectives, whether it's revenue or cost optimization or more users or things like that, right? So you are not directly necessarily impacting the end user, but you may be impacting the business that's targeting those users.
And what strategies or frameworks do you keep in mind when you analyzing uh, the industry for an enterprise business?
Correct. And it really depends on the kind of business you are, and the kind of solutions and services that you're providing, right? My background has been much more focused on supply chain risk compliance type of solutions. So it tended to be a lot more about regulatory drivers and how do you simplify regulations, which is always a complicated topic, and also how do you make it accessible to an audience that needs to use his products on a daily basis. So the consumerization of that kind of tends to become a little bit more important as well, especially nowadays where there's an expectation that how you use Uber needs to be the same way how we solve a regulatory or compliance issue, and that's the reality is that's not easy to do, right? So that's the kind of thing that you need to think about. So the frameworks can vary in terms of what kind of frameworks you follow, and again, it depends on the type of business you're operating. Typically, the frameworks that we followed is we tend to have a lot more of kind of good to have, nice to have type of elements, because we have to prioritize our requirements and our requests based on the customers that are there, and it tends to be a small group of customers, but it tends to be a vocal group of customers, right? And you also have inherently proxies by your sales team that is essentially being the proxy for the customer. They have the best interest of their customer, and more importantly, best interest for themselves to drive incentives, to drive the benefits to their customers. But then we are supposed to be, we as product managers, we need to be figuring out what's the right thing to do, and how do you balance competing priorities, whether it's your sales team, customer prioritization, large customers, small customers, overall roadmap. That's the typical kind of prioritization effort that it gets tricky many times, and depending on the type of organization you're in, you might have more control as a product manager, or you might have less control. It might be more of a sales driven control, so you kind of have to balance that out a little bit.
And how do you prioritize? Like, what goes into your prioritization techniques?
Yeah. Like everything, it depends. I wish there was an easy answer, but a couple of things that I've typically done in the past is, it depends. First, let's take an example of an existing product, right? It's been around for 5, 10 years. Typically, how do you prioritize feature set on those products? Typically, we have a number of customers already on that product and on that platform that are using them. So prioritization really depends upon what's the most impact we can do to the customers being requesting the capability or a feature. And sometimes it might be a large customer that's asking for a particular request, and so that might kind of go ahead of the queue compared to something that's a little bit more incremental or a little bit more widespread for a broader audience, right? And again, there's no right answer there. You might prioritize for a large customer at a potential detriment to yourself, right? Long-term strategy, but you kind of have to make that cost benefit analysis, right? Then if it's something like a newer initiative or a newer, kind of product that you're recently launched 1, 2 years, 2, 3 years, and you've got a couple of early adopters and some pilots that you're working on with some early customers, then you got to prioritize based on what's going to give you the biggest bang for buck, right? But the challenge there is, you need to focus on making sure the features that you're trying to build achieves the target objectives of that product that you're launching. Because if you get a large customer on a new product, a new capability, they can derail you significantly in taking you in a direction that might be very custom to them, but not translatable to other customers and other users on the platform. Right. So you as a product manager has to be a little bit more careful to balancing, the request of the one, even though it might be a very large, customer, versus the request of the many, which is probably where long term strategically you may want to take the product and where you want to grow the product.
Yeah, it just seems like a little bit difficult to kind of like make that balance, but how do you do that? How do you maintain that balance? Keep maintaining the business objective at the end?
Yeah, and so I mean, a couple of things is obviously, use data and communicate that effectively is a big part of it, right? And start working with your immediate peers that you're working with. Like, we can't do this one request by a large customer, and it will be, kind of will derail us, it'll push us by 6 months on kind of the broader initiative. At the end of the day, you'll kind of have to get buy-in from your, stakeholders, whether that's your leadership team or your, head of sales or your head of the business, whoever that is, and within your, your close vicinity, in terms of the what right product strategy is, right? Because anything you do within this framework will have some impact, whether it is an impact to the roadmap or impact to the growth or impact to the business, right? So there's a lot of impact there, and it's really about balancing that impact, right? And somebody will have to kind of be the voice of that reason and say, okay, yes, I'm willing to take this hit, whether that's 10% less in revenue, so that long term there's a benefit. Or what, I need to, we are focused on revenue growth this year, so we got to take the 10% growth, and then we can figure out the how do we fix the situation at a later date, right? So there's a lot of ways to balance that out, but at the end of the day, you kind of have to go back to the to your leadership team and to your stakeholder team with the right data, and communicate, right? I think one of the biggest things I did in my role is communicate, 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 right? It's like the amount of times I have to say the same message multiple times to different stakeholders and different people within the organization. It's like I feel like a broken record, but you cannot have less communication.
What brings me it brings me to the next question. How do you manage the stakeholders?
Yeah, so that's I think that kind of goes back to that communication is the first part of it, right? Managing them is okay, making sure everybody's bought into the strategy, and more importantly, reminded that we have a strategy that we've already bought into, right? Because for better or worse, the sales team can be your best friend or your worst nightmare, right? So you kind of have to make sure that they are constantly being updated into where we are headed, how what we are tracking towards long term growth of the product strategy and product vision, versus some short term quarterly commitments that they have, right? And if you partner with them effectively and say that, okay, here's where we are, here's what we need to achieve, they might come in with like some really good ideas sometimes, in terms of new customers come in, or an existing customer that has driven some product initiatives, and how we can like an example, integrate into their existing life cycle. That might be a good idea for us to potentially prioritize now, which will have some significant benefit for all our customers that are on the platform. Right. So kind of starting with that communication mindset, and making sure there is engagement at all levels of your stakeholders, whether with the salespeople, with the leadership team, etc., and everybody's bought into kind of the product strategy is going to be important. And then, your technology team is your partner, right? They are the ones who are going to be working with you side by side, making sure that we can deliver on the commitments that we are communicating to the larger audience. So that's definitely going to be an aspect of essentially partners in crime with your tech team and your tech organizations, to make sure that we are in lockstep and communicating the same message. In terms of the product organization saying that this is how we do it, this is why we do it, and the technology saying that this is when we do it, and this is how do we execute on those kind of commitments.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then in terms of like just advice for anyone that is in going into product management and going into enterprise management, how does that differentiate with just general product management? What are the skills or knowledge that they need to brush up on?
Correct. So, enterprise product management in general is slightly different than your consumer product management, right? Most of the kind of online articles and blogs and stuff that you read, or even books and sessions that you attend, tend to be focused on consumer product management. So they talk about lean, they talk about A/B testing, they talk about MVP. All of that goes out the door. Enterprise product management doesn't necessarily follow that. You can, institute some of those practices, but you kind of have to play by the ear and see how those fit within the organization sales life cycle and the product management life cycle in general. You can do things internally, like within your own internal organization. You can, do certain things. You can do lean processes. You can do agile methodology. All of that works within your internal, team framework. But the minute you kind of expose it outside of your team, whether it's your sales team or your customer team, it starts to get very difficult to kind of follow those practices, right? No enterprise customer is going to want a half baked product, right? For them, they want a complete product, right? So you can never really do MVP for them, right? They want a complete product. They want to they want to test it. They want to what do you call, integrate it into their workflows and life cycle. Additionally, the other thing is, it's hard to test certain capabilities with your customers before they've signed up. So some of those elements have to be done post, kind of, sign of contract, or post them becoming a customer, right? So that's the other element that you kind of have to factor in, that you're not going to get a lot of data upfront. You might be able to do certain interviews, and you can definitely kind of, as part of the sales cycle, kind of get exposed to a lot of ideas during that process. But the unfortunate nature is, until they start using it, which is pretty much after either getting a pilot or either getting closing the deal, you're not going to get realistic data from them, right? So you kind of have to use that frame of reference to shift from a validation mindset to kind of iterative mindset post sale, and okay, how can we quickly meet the needs of what they're trying to do, all right? But the good news with that is, the typical sales process tends to be fairly long. 6 months, 9 months, sometimes a year and a half. It tends to be fairly long, depending on the kind of product you're selling, right? And so you have time to think through what expectations the client will have. You have time to kind of validate at various points of the life cycle with your sales team and with your customers that you're talking to, the sponsors on the customer side. So there's a lot of benefits by doing that. So you kind of have to use that to your advantage and essentially leverage those insights. And essentially, if there's things you could tweak along the way with your product framing, that's definitely something you kind of have to leverage on, right? So that's the frame in terms of how to think about product management for enterprise. Now, what kind of skills are required? One thing that has helped me personally is a lot more kind of soft skills than it is hard skills, if you will. Because I did consulting, after my MBA, I actually benefited from essentially listening to the customer, listening to the client, in my consulting days, and understanding their asks and needs and wants, and balancing stakeholders. That tends to be a big part of what you need to do essentially in product management. Your engineering team is going to say, okay, this is going to be 2 months out frame. Sales team wants it today. Leadership team wants the revenue forecast as soon as possible, and you are the one driving all these expectations across the team. So kind of listening to all of them and trying to figure out what's the best strategy, best message that can, you'll never satisfy everyone, but at least you can kind of get a consistent message across them, and consistent yeah, what do you call, opinion across all of them is going to be important. And more importantly, not just listening to them, but understanding what's behind the ask, right? Because everybody's driven by incentives in some way, shape, or form. So if you know what the right incentives are, why they're asking for a certain thing, whether it's a customers or a sales team or your engineering team, you can use that to your advantage, and you can use that to drive. I know, the sales team is looking for a kind of a commission or kind of, end of the quarter kind of incentive. So how can we translate the thing from a being a, this feature is going to drive an incentive, that, okay, can we sell more of this type of product, still get that incentive? So those are the kinds of trade-offs you can make and do that. So kind of focusing on the soft skills definitely helps in an enterprise play where there's kind of more direct access to the stakeholders, and much more balance in terms of how you kind of connect with each of those different stakeholders.
Got it. Got it. When you mentioned the sales team, so how do you make sure that that you're still product led growth versus sales led growth? How do you maintain that?
Yeah, and that's a tricky balance, and that unfortunately sometimes comes down to the culture of the company. So in some companies, there's a lot more sales focused, product development. In other companies, it's product led product development, right? So it really depends, and that balance shifts even within management changes, right? So, and I've seen that in my time as well, where in a span of 7 8 years, I've gone from sales to product to sales to product, in various phases of the leadership teams, right? So it really depends about how that kind of structure is maintained. But at the end of the day, if you have good partners with your sales team, and the sales and the product organizations are kind of running in cohesion together, it shouldn't matter, right? You might have pushes and pulls in certain ways, but as long as they understand, the sales team understands where you're coming from in terms of what your motivation is and what you're driving, and we have, I would say, consistent goals that we both are trying to achieve. At the end of the day, both of us want to achieve certain growth. How we achieve it is really the objective, right? So as long as they understand what product is trying to do and why we're trying to do certain things, then they can effectively position and communicate the right way to the to the customer audience, right? And same vice versa, right? If, we in the product organization understand what's driving the sales mindset, what we can do, we can start to factor in alternatives, short-term gaps, other approaches to making sure that the sales teams are successful. So that is really the success, I think, in the right ways, making each of us successful in our own way. And it has helped me a lot, right? You you find the key sales champions that you potentially work with, and use them as your sounding board, use them as your essentially the voice of the customer, because you may not have frequent access to the customers, but they are talking to them every single day, right? So if you leverage that to your benefit, I think it'll benefit both the organizations effectively. And whether it's product led or sales led, doesn't really matter. We both are kind of singing to the same song, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good reminder of that. And going tying it back to what you mentioned earlier, kind of knowing what the end goal is for each discipline that you're working with, is a good way to think about it too. I just want to remind the viewers, if there's any questions, to pop it in the chat. Um, my next question for you is, any advice that you have for those that are currently in just B2C that want to transition into B2B? What advice would you give those people?
Yeah, so and so from an enterprise product management, personally, why I liked it is it's a lot more difficult to solve enterprise products. Just, and maybe that's a personal personal interest in mine, but I just felt that consumer products, there is there's obviously scale, there's a lot of problem solving, and you try to understand and find the right solutions upfront, right? But with enterprise product management, it's much more about integrating into the life cycle of a customer. Making sure that you're effectively solving the problem of the buyer and the users. And there's another challenge too, right? Who you're potentially selling your products to is not necessarily the users who are using that product,
Mm.
right? So you essentially have two stakeholders, right? You have to make your the buyer of your product, the executives or the senior leadership on the customer side, successful. That means what kind of ROI do they have? What kind of benefits do they get? Are they going to be looking good? Because at the end of the day, they are going to be your champions, right? You want them to be your champions in conferences and sessions, and say, yeah, you worked with Heyman, then you worked with this product, and the best things is sliced bread, whatever it is, right? But at the end of the day, the users of the product are the one that needs to be satisfied, because they're going to give feedback to their leadership that this product is not meeting the needs of what they need, right? So you kind of have two audiences you need to satisfy, and they have different, again, kind of goes back to that incentives. They have different incentives and objectives that you need to kind of meet. So that's the first thing you need to start thinking about. Is it's not just about the direct access to the users. It's about making sure the direct, you kind of fit, meeting the needs of these two audiences, and making sure that those audiences are satisfied in some way, shape, or form, right? So that's a big element of that. Now, how do you think about that in from a product management perspective? So the lot of the standard ways around agile development, around building products, lean startups, innovations, all of that still exists in enterprise product. I don't disagree with that, but the bigger thing is really about figuring out how some of the things that you ideally could have done in a consumer space, like A/B testing. That's hard to do in product management. Customer interviews. That's not as simple as to do, but kind of have to make it a force of habit to get yourself as a product manager working with the sales team and trying to be in front of the customers as much as you can, right? And then kind of more importantly, you have access to a potential smaller group of individuals, but listen to their needs and how to solve the problem, and not their requests, right? It kind of goes back to that old saying: if you asked 100 years ago, how can I make the horse cart faster, they'll tell you, I want faster horses, right? So you kind of have to use that in the back of your head, and not think about what they're trying to ask for, but what problem are they trying to solve, and then use your curiosity and use your skills to figure out what's the right way to solve the problem, because you have an objective as a product manager to solve the long-term vision of the product, not necessarily the short-term vision of one user or one customer.
Got it. Thank you for that. Another question is, what would you tell yourself when just starting out in product management? What would you tell yourself? Um, what would you now tell your then self?
So I think what I would have tell my then self was, in a sense, that there's a lot of resources out there that you should definitely reach out to. And this was a gap that I had when I was younger in my career. I did not seek out mentors and advisors in whatever field you're interested in, right? Doesn't need to be product management, but generally in the field. That was not something I really did actively. But now that I'm kind of in my mid career, and I realize that the power of mentorship and the power of talking to experts in the field and kind of getting advice. That was one thing, I would have done a little bit better in my early stage of my career. I would have tried to seek out more, industry veterans and people who are actually in the space, and kind of get a lot more advice. And that's part of the reason why I try to do it now, because I realized that was a gap, and I tried to do everything myself. I tried to learn everything myself, but now I want to try to give back and try to see how much I can actually contribute, to the next generation. So that's the goal, and I want to see where that goes, and help in any way I can. But that was one thing I would have changed in terms of my approach, and some of the things, some of the mistakes, some of the missteps that I've probably had. I would have thought about it differently, or have done it differently if I've had that, kind of mentoring during that time frame.
And for someone who's new to mentorship, what does that usually look like? Like, I know you mentor now, but what does that relationship look like?
I mean, it can be as complex or as simple as you want it to be, right? In the sense that it could be, I just want a sounding board. Many times, some of the people I speak to, they have all the answers. They just want somebody to validate the answers, right? That is like, okay, I'm like thinking about this. I'm like, yeah, you got it right. That makes sense. There's nothing wrong with that. Just go do it, right? It's as simple as that. In other scenarios, it could be okay. They don't necessarily know how to think about, agile development, for example, or they don't know how to think about product strategy, or they don't know how to think about vision making, right? So you can try to give examples or situations of how to think about that, how to frame that, right, in terms of what to think and what to do, and that can go a long way to give them some boundaries of, yeah, if you're thinking about XYZ topic, here's what has worked for me in the past, here's how I've done it, here's how I've, where I've made a mistake. And once they hear that, they can essentially understand, okay, what to do, what not to do. At the end of the day, they need to drive their own agenda, and they need to drive their own initiatives forward. All I can do is kind of help see, this is the right road to take. There's thorns and bushes on that road. There's probably rose petals and less thorns in this road. There's still going to be thorns. You just but it's a, which is the better road to take, right? But that's really the objective. Is it can be as complicated or as simple as it wants to be. But then, if you are, a mentee and trying to seek out mentorship opportunities, try to talk to a number of different people. It's not the fact that you just have to talk to one person and they'll have all the answers. I'll tell you, I don't have all the answers myself, right? But if I don't, if I can tell you, point you in some other direction, I'll probably give you, what, you should probably talk to these type of people or these kinds of folks, and you can try to get some guidance of where to reach out to. So that's really the mindset. I don't, we should not overcomplicate it. It's just, start talking to people, communicate, and you'll figure it out.
Thank you for that. I have one more question
Yeah.
before we finish up, because I don't see any questions here. But what are your go-to books that anyone that comes to you with product management, hey, like, what resources would you give them to them?
Yeah, so a couple of older books that I've read in the past. This one by Rich Mironov, I believe it's called, which is Art of Product Management. That's a really good book to look into. It's kind of talks about the style and more of the soft skills of product management. There's a ton of stuff online to read for sure about product management, so it's easy to get into a big rabbit hole around that. Um, then on kind of the more business books, like Crossing the Chasm is good. And then there's another one which I recently read called Atomic Habits, which is actually really good about productivity and how to think about incremental progress. It's not really a product management book, but it can apply to the same concept. You make small progress over a long period of time, and that essentially leads to a much bigger push into how you actually achieve those goals. But thinking about it as small atomic activities is really interesting. So that's a recent book that I read.
Oh, thank you for that. Thank you so much for your time and all your experience and everything you shared with us today. I know that there is a way to reach you through LinkedIn, and we've included that. And thank you so much. Appreciate it.
No, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and look forward to anybody who wants to connect on this topic. I'm really passionate about it.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye, everyone.